tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Karin Wilkins, who is a professor in the Department of Radio, TV, Film at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as the Associate Director for the Center for Middle East Studies. Dr. Wilkins' research focuses on global communication, development, and social change. Her most recent book is Homeland Security: What We Learn About Arab Communities from Action-Adventure Films. Her published work can be found in Redeveloping Communication for Social Change, Communication Theory, Media, Culture, and Society, the Journal of Communication, International Journal of Public Opinion Quarterly, among other venues. Dr. Wilkins' talk tonight is titled Wearing Shades in the Bright Future of Digital Media: Limitations of U.S. Narratives of Media Power in Egyptian Resistance.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm very excited about our discussion mostly. So I'm going to give an overview of some literature and some recent research. But what I'd really like to do then is to focus much more time on our discussion and to hear your own perspectives and your own questions. What I'm going to be getting to is some recent reflections on the way that the U.S. news constructed politics more broadly in Egypt early last year, and the important role that the digital media came to play within that narrative. I'm particularly interested in the narrative and the limitations of this narrative as it sits within the U.S. culture and the U.S. discourse. So one issue that I know is important is the role of media within politics and communications in society and in politics and uprisings. But what I'm going to be focusing more on today is the U.S. perspective on those issues and how it fits U.S. discourse. This issue matters a great deal right now. I would say understanding communications and politics always matters because politics is fueled by, interpreted through communications. Communications is that interdisciplinary approach that brings things to light. This matters particularly right now because this is a particular historical juncture. And if you're at all familiar with Naomi Klein's work and the shock doctrine, it's important to understand that when there are moments in history when certain events are taking place, it gives the potential for political change. And this is a time that I think the United States needs to think seriously about its role in the Middle East, how it is acting, what it can do differently, and the way that media can be part of this process, because the stories we tell and transmit through media can potentially limit our possibilities. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the theoretical background that I'm working from. One particular theoretical trope that I'm working from is from Edward Said's Orientalism, the namesake for Marwan Credy's chair. So by Orientalism, I'm talking about a particular ideological approach that becomes part of the work of institutions. So I'll be talking more specifically about media today, but the connection between the way media tells stories as a way of justifying military intervention, as the way educational institutions design a curriculum and a program, how we decide what courses matter, for example. All of these things are rooted in our ideologies or understandings of what matters. So it's not only that within the U.S. media we have a dominance of a particular idea of how the U.S. is situated in the world, but also I'd like to argue that there's a persistence in the Orientalist tropes. And there's a persistence even when there are small shifts in the way media construct things, there is a persistence over time. The theoretical ideas that I'm talking about also have to do with the way media work within institutions, the way the politics become part of our cultural assumptions in our society. I'm interested too in the way that the economic structures of our industries somehow can limit the constructions that are possible in media, and the organizational dynamics. So if we think about the construction of film, for example, it's similar in scope, in a sense, to the construction of news, in that there are roles that people play in the creation of a media product, and there's a hierarchy. So one of the things we can talk about in discussion, for example, is what it takes to try to make a film be more complicated, for example. The media narratives, this is an important part of this particular approach. And what I would say is that there are ways of telling stories, and some stories get to dominate and some don't. I'm going back to someone whose work I like from the past, Gregory Bateson. One of his tenets was the map is not the territory. So the mapping, the human construction that we place on a territory is not the same thing as the territory. The stories we tell are not the same thing as an objective reality. We have lots of subjective experiences that become intersubjectively understood. In other words, there's a social construction of reality, and these narratives are part of this. So what happens is that these narratives get created by people, and then they structure the way we work. And so I've just got some examples up here. When people are trained in psychology, for example, there are a lot of different ways that therapists can work, and when they're confronted with a wide diversity of human psychological problems, they tend to focus on channeling people into the diagnoses that they know how to solve. Same is true in terms of gendered expectations in the media. If women, for example, are socialized with narratives in which women are subservient, they become more comfortable in those kinds of subservient roles. And the area that I do actually most of my research in, development, the world is a very complicated place full of many different kinds of problems. And development institutions have specialties. And so they take a very complicated world and restructure problems into those that they as institutions can solve. So the narratives that kind of have an overplay in importance here are constructed in ways that are limiting. But the narratives, even though some groups are able to dominate over others, there is, I would say, an important dynamic component to this process. There's a politics to this. And groups that are organizing to engage in political protest of any kind can engage in this kind of reflexivity, thinking through these kinds of issues. I also want to say something about the methodological approach that I use. I use something that's called a critical realist approach, and what I mean by that is that there's a reality, kind of a socially and politically constructed reality to the way we understand the world. So people create policies and structures, people create organizations, whether they're formally constituted like the American University or informally created in terms of mobilized protests. So people create groups and policies, and then these policies in turn can limit human agency, and these are dynamic. So the critical realist approach begins with a sense of people and structure, but it also has a very critical approach and moving beyond what's very common in a lot of U.S. conventional wisdom about politics, which follows a more pluralist idea. The pluralist idea is that everyone has equal power. Everyone has the opportunity to vote, for example. It's a very narrow, very limited way of understanding politics. The critical approach recognizes that some people and some groups have more power than others to act and to have their actions have effect. So the communication becomes important in terms of the political contest here. Before I talk more specifically about Egypt, what I'd like to do is to go over research that has been done specifically that I've done and in terms of other people's research about the way U.S. media construct the Middle East in terms of many different kinds of genres, I think what's interesting here is I've done work on action-adventure film. I've done work on U.S. constructions of foreign aid in the Middle East and on U.S. news and information about Palestinian issues and Middle Eastern issues. And when I take a step back and look at all of that, there is an incredible resonance, an incredible similarity in these findings over many years and across all these different media constructions. So I'm going to start with action-adventure film because I think that this narrative trope becomes so dominant in all these other kinds of media constructions as well. With action-adventure, and I've read some of the screenwriting textbooks about how to write action-adventure. And as you know, it relies on a very simplistic plot structure. You begin with an exciting event, then you build suspense, and then the plot must conclude with the hero saving a victim from a villain in some symbolic, heroic act. This is a plot that oversimplifies lots of complicated human characteristics into people who are clearly villains, victims, and heroes. So this narrative structure, I also want to ground this in a sense of global Hollywood. This is a genre that is very highly distributed and very highly profitable because it doesn't demand as much translation. Comedy is harder to sell across cultures. Action-adventure is easy. Less dialogue, easily understood. Another part of the industry I want to highlight from a book called Global Hollywood by Toby Miller, the connection between the U.S. political elite and the Hollywood film industry. Jack Valenti, who was head of the Motion Picture Association, very clearly was interested in working with high-level U.S. government officials as a way of justifying war, as a way of saying, yes, the U.S. has an important role to play and we should be doing this. Now, I wanted to say that I'm not agreeing with this at all. I think it's a problem, but I do think it's important to recognize that film isn't just film, but related to the politics of a culture. So in a lot of interesting research in media studies, people have shown that if you give, then this is research on Americans, and I don't claim that it's transferable at all, but studies of news items and my own research on film, if you give Americans a film or a news item and you don't even identify the ethnicity of the villains, and you ask them a week later, retell the story, whether it's news or film, people will insert certain characteristics that are usually African American or Muslim when they describe the villains, even if it wasn't in the story in the first place. So there's an enduring prejudice that becomes part of people's mediated memory. In some research I did a few years ago, I was particularly interested in differences across Arab American groups and other groups in the United States and the way they understood action-adventure film. So this is just very briefly summarizing research I've done with focus groups and surveys. Grossly oversimplifying, but basically the action-adventure fans know a lot less about the region. They're more likely to believe the films to be realistic, and they're more likely to evidence prejudice, particularly if they've never been in the region or don't know anybody from the region. And that fits a lot of media studies research, that if you don't know something about a group or a place, you're more likely to be affected by the media. Now, I do want to qualify this, though, and say it's not that watching action-adventure films make you stupid. It's that people with particular backgrounds and interests in the world might be more likely to be interested in the films in the first place or more excited about them in the first place. So I just wanted to give that caveat. But what matters, I think, most here, particularly in terms of American culture, is that it's not just one film. And I've written about The Siege, for example. But it's not just one film that matters. It's not even just action-adventure that matters, but it's the accumulation of the same kind of story that's told over and over again and across all these different genres. It's that resonance across the genres that really matters. So in other work, I do work in the field called development communication. And usually that means looking at how communications technologies like TV and digital media can be used for particular development goals. But another aspect of my field is what development programs communicate about the nature of problems and how we can solve problems. So in another set of research, I was looking at how one of the early U.S. writers on development, Daniel Lerner, how he articulated the Middle East, and here's a quote that basically sums up his approach here: what America is, the modernizing Middle East seeks to become. And I wanted to know, to what extent is this approach still prevalent in published documents of the way the U.S. government thinks it's approaching the Middle East? And in some ways it's changed, and in some ways it's a little different. It's only a little different in that now the U.S. pays attention to the environment. But the other programs are all clearly within that modernization paradigm. But then I started thinking about how the narrative of foreign aid is similar to the narrative of action venture film. We still have the same idea of a victim, and particularly in U.S. articulations of the Middle Eastern region and in Afghanistan, there's a highlighting of women as a justification for intervention. Women, children, and in some cases people who are poor become articulated as the victims, but then if they are the victims and the people who are suffering, why? And that's where the villain comes in. Why is it that these people are having problems in the development discourse? And what Daniel Lerner talked about 50 years ago and is still part of that U.S. discourse is traditional culture. There's an oversimplification of modernity, tradition, as if they're completely separate and the world can be understood in this dichotomy. And traditional culture is blamed for the problems. Political corruption also becomes more highlighted in more recent articulations of U.S. foreign aid. There's also a lot of attention to the problem being that governments are paying for things rather than corporations. And this comes in to play with a lot of World Bank discussions, not so much with the UN discussions, but also with the U.S. Agency for International Development. They want governments to be privatizing in all kinds of industry, in all kinds of ways. And there is a political, economic importance and benefit to that for people in the elite in the United States. But that becomes the problems that are articulated, and then the hero in the discourse is always the American government who comes in with foreign aid. That's the story. And that fits so much the action venture genre, because the content analyses all show, and you know this from seeing movies, the hero is usually a white male American, unless it's Denzel Washington. And he's kind of the only non-white person. And even when Arnold Schwarzenegger becomes the hero, they usually will position him with a coffee mug that says the United States. Just to be clear, we know he's not quite American, but he sort of is, but we'll give him the mug. And if you look at films, old films of Arnold Schwarzenegger, look for those symbolic connections to the United States. The other hero in the development discourse is modernity. Modernity is the kind of that radiant stage of when all things are better. And how do you get to modernity? You have faith in technology. And this is a really important part of the argument that I want to make. The development discourse says people will become modern and be saved from traditional culture. Lerner said radio. Now we're saying Facebook. That's the story that we're telling, and that's the resonance. So there are important consequences to this. The U.S. tends to be positioned as a savior and as an ideal, as the ideal state against which all other countries need to be measured. This is part of that. So what we have then is a way of understanding the world that in the United States that fits that discourse. And Timothy Mitchell and others have done really interesting work about the variety of problems, for example, in Egypt, equity clearly being important, but the way the U.S. describes Egypt is that it's a demographic problem. Too many people on such a small bit of land. Therefore, the most important solution in old U.S. discourse was population programs. So these structures then guide resources and where USAID should spend its money. In another study that I did with John Noakes, we looked at news coverage of Palestinian issues over time just to see if they changed over time. And in some senses, when the Palestinians took actions that were somewhat connected to what the U.S. wanted them to do in 1993, 1994, the coverage is more sympathetic. But there were still persistent tropes in the narrative over time. Israel was seen as the victim over time no matter what. The U.S. was seen as the savior no matter what. So there were, in some senses, small shifts in coverage, but it didn't change dramatically. In another study that I did with John Downing, we looked at the way the U.S. news media covered political protests of the film The Siege. So this is a really interesting topic I'd be happy to talk about in the discussion section. Really interesting film because Larry Wright, who is the screenwriter, had intended a different kind of script. Jack Shaheen, who's a consultant in the United States, had been consulted on the film. It turned out to be a film that a lot of groups in the United States had a serious problem with. So they organized protests at local theaters when the film was about to premiere. So we did a look at the way those protests and the film was presented in the news. And what I think was interesting is that at first the coverage was somewhat dismissive of the problems people had with the film, but when there were local groups organizing at theaters, and those local groups had people talking to journalists and local presses personally, they were more sympathetic. The national press was not very sympathetic to the people protesting. And what was interesting, too, in the news discourse was debates over whether or not portraying people as terrorists, whether that was realistic or not. So that was part of what became highlighted. So given these different kinds of studies that have been done, is an interesting resonance, again, across genres and over time in the way that the stories are told. So given that as a backdrop, I'm going to talk a little bit about some research more recently that some of us have done in the way the U.S. news constructs the Egyptian political protests last year, and again, how digital media become part of that story. Now, digital media do become an important part of the U.S. news story, but it's important to kind of take a look at the media landscape here. So these are statistics across a few different kinds of sources, and they're just rough estimates at this point. But clearly a lot more people have access to television and transnational satellite television and cell phones than to the internet, and particularly to Facebook and Twitter, just to give this as a background. So in terms of digital media may be really important in terms of mobilizing people who have access, who tend to be educated youth. In the U.S., we had very little attention to cell phones in terms of understanding the communication landscape. And cell phones were also clearly very important. And Marwan and others have done some really important work on transnational satellite television and how important that has been in the region in terms of creating different kinds of spaces for political contests and critique and transnational appeals. I also am particularly appreciative of this notion that Marwan has of hypermedia space and the importance of convergent media. I mean, this is also just to point out that television isn't just television anymore. It's hard to understand a medium as a specific medium when so many are interconnected. If you're getting television over your computer, you're sending notes over your phone, it's very difficult to talk about media as a medium. It's much more important to see those connections. The other bit of background that I just want to preface the media discussion with is the importance of context, historical, social, political, regional. So even thinking back to the importance of the protests in Iran not too long ago in 2009, I think all of this matters a great deal. And understanding how these other regional conditions come into play does get discussed a little bit in the U.S. news, but we don't have as much attention to issues within Egypt like inflation. More attention to corruption because of the villainization of Mubarak. Understanding the social trends, though, is something that doesn't become part of the discourse. The importance of understanding a highly unemployed group of young people who are, over time, more distrustful of the government. There are interesting surveys looking at people's distrust of the government over time, but one of the things that I would just want to mention is that when you ask people in surveys if they're distrustful of the government, there are certain times when it's okay to say you're distrustful of the government and certain times that it's not. So the validity of responses on surveys about distrust just have to be put into context in terms of when those surveys have taken place. But the history in Egypt, too, of labor unions and how labor unions have organized and the politics of the Kafaya movement and others, all of these are important conditions within Egypt that are largely missed by the U.S. And so this discussion is based on an analysis of 198 articles that were identified through LexisNexis, looking at this very brief time period of the U.S. news coverage. And so a lot of them come from the New York Times and CNN, but also some of these are transcripts from some of the other more central national news sources. The plot tends to use a lot of what I would call a volcano metaphor, the word uprising, the idea of being on edge. That helps to fit the narrative of building suspense. And at first, the U.S. news coverage was kind of vague because the U.S. didn't quite know how to act in relation to the Egyptian protests. But one of the things that I found interesting is that even within the different sources I looked at, Fox and ABC were more likely to look at this as something chaotic, something that was not organized. It was a crisis. The idea of there are different ways of looking at political protests. You can look at this as sort of an unruly mob, kind of crazy, scary kind of thing. Or you can look at this as an organized, well thought out protest with significance and meaning. And the New York Times was more likely to use the word march, kind of emphasizing that there was some sense of organization and substance behind it. So then, taking the kind of structure that I talked about in terms of the other genres, I wanted to think about then in this story, who is the victim? In other words, who is suffering? What is the problem? Why are people suffering? And then, what is the solution? Who are the heroes in the narrative? The victims. And this is, again, this is not my personal feeling. This is the way the U.S. news media, based on a summary of those 198 articles, approach this. The Egyptian people were the most prominently described victim. We have a lot of attention to women, again, but the other kind of anthropomorphization is the archaeological treasures. There was a lot of U.S. media attention to concern over what would happen to what was in the Egyptian museum. Americans become victimized as well, particularly tourists and citizens, a lot of attention to the abuses of journalists. But it's the digital media also, the internet, the cell service, when these are threatened, these become part of this articulation of victim as well. And thinking along these lines of victims not just being people, but things that become threatened, the global economy becomes one of the victims in this story. The global economy, particularly in terms of oil and investment. And as an example here, the New York Times talks about jitters for oil companies that ship through Egypt, raising concerns that the violence in Egypt might pose a threat to the world energy supplies. So if these groups and media and global economy become articulated as the victims, the villains become mostly the attention goes to Mubarak. And this also fits the way we tell stories in the United States. We like stories where there's a clear villain, because that villain then personifies all that is evil. And there's this thought that once you get rid of that one person, all will be well. That's the Hollywood narrative. You kill the villain, the hero kills the villain, and then everyone lives happily ever after, right? That's the Hollywood narrative. So instead of looking at a broad system of corruption, understanding the role of the army within Egyptian politics and the army in terms of Egyptian economy, we get no attention to that. All of the attention becomes centered on the person, the individual who is Mubarak. The mukhabarat, the police, become present in terms of their abuses and imprisonment of people. And so they become part of the villains as well, but also fitting dominant U.S. discourse in terms of their villainization of Islam, the threat of Islam, the threat of Muslim Brotherhood. It's not discussed and understood. It's instead posed as a problem, something to fear. And the heroes, the dominant heroes in this story in the U.S. news become the youth, the educated youth, the youth who dress like, talk like people the United States can understand. Yeah, I've done research a long time ago on the representation of Hanan Ashrawi and the way her dress enables her to be presented very sympathetically in U.S. news media. It's kind of the same story here. But it's not just the educated youth, but it's the educated youth who use digital media, the ones who use Facebook. And that becomes the saving grace in the story. And there are a lot of examples of this. I'm giving just a few right here. CNN, Facebook is really driving this revolution. Again, no attention to labor unions or more broadly based economic frustration. The idea that the youth, armed with nothing but Facebook and the power of their convictions, have drawn millions into the street to demand a true Egyptian democracy. I have some examples here. I'm not going to spend time trying to get internet connection and showing, but if you're interested in looking at this, I think one of the really interesting ways of understanding the story is the CNN. This is a slideshow of their visuals from January 25th till about February 15th, and they've picked a slide to represent each day, and they tell the story, summarizing it really along the lines that I'm talking about. Now, the heroes of the story are not only the youth in digital media, but in the same way the action-adventure film likes to say, here's the American hero, we have the U.S. become part of the hero in a few ways. If you look at the headlines, the U.S. is often the subject of the sentence or the representative of the U.S. So Obama presses for change, or Clinton calls for orderly transition. And so there's a sense of action-adventure hero justifying intervention. There's also a sense of it being a mission. So there's a missionary sense to this, just as there is in the development discourse. There's an assumption that the U.S. will be involved. It's just a question of how. It doesn't tend to be whether, it tends to be how. And that CNN timeline of the slideshow illustrates the overall narrative here that tells the story of the protests in Egypt. It fits that Hollywood narrative so nicely because you begin on January 25th with a day of rage. The way you would begin a film. It's an event. And then if you look at the coverage, there's a building of suspense. Mubarak might leave. Oh no, he says he's not going to, but now he might. So you have this suspense happening over time. And then if you look at the attention to the stories, it builds and it builds until Mubarak is gone. And then the next slides you have of the following days are of people cleaning up Tahrir Square. So, story's over. You know, that they're cleaning up now. Everybody's happy because he's gone. And we see this narrative in so many ways. And even when you have a leader and you don't have dramatic visuals, they can be manufactured. You can have people topple a statue. just for the sake of concluding your story with a happy Hollywood visual ending. So telling the story in this way is limited in many different ways. It can be what can be folded as an episodic approach. And this is a function of media that are needing to tell stories quickly for a variety of economic reasons. The episodic approach misses the historical context. It misses the broader thematic issues that really matter, like employment, like growing inequity. All of the attention in the U.S. news to what's happening in Egypt as a nation, if you look at the story by itself, it often misses the connection to things that are happening in the region and global dimensions of conflict. The characterizations are limited as well. And it's not that youth doesn't matter, and I'm not saying that digital media don't matter, but rather by focusing too much attention, by focusing your spotlight or your camera on those only, that the media are missing attention to other things that really matter a great deal. So by focusing on youth at the exclusion of labor movements and other political groups, misses attention to the broader context. By focusing on digital media, we're also, in an arbitrary way, reifying distinctions between old and new media that don't really make sense. People talk over the telephone. People talk in person. There are visuals in some media, not others. So the convergence matters. And the highlighting, the over-privileging of digital media misses the importance of cell phones, transnational television. It also tends to talk about digital media as if what really matters is that people have access to creating content, and that does matter. But what we often have in the U.S. media is this wondrous belief that new media, digital media are liberating, that this offers some sort of new happy liberation, and not enough attention in the U.S. news to the potential for digital media to be used by governments for surveillance, by corporations to gather private information about you that can be used. So the media can be used for surveillance by groups in power just as much as it can be used for enabling different kinds of change. I particularly have some problems with the over-attention in the U.S. news media to calling what happened in Egypt a Facebook revolution. And this is a framework that gets used over and over again. Facebook clearly is a problem because not many people have access. There are other media that matter. But the other problem with the term Facebook is that it's a corporate name. So we're giving a lot of attention to a corporate name that will perhaps give more money to people who have shares in Facebook. It's not Facebook, I think, that matters, but the human potential that's enabled through technologies. It's also clearly a revolution in the Hollywood sense of the way the story is told. But the way that story is told misses all of the frustration that preceded January 25th, and it misses everything that's happened since, and the importance of politics and power since the resignation of Mubarak. There are important implications to Americans, given Americans' limited discourse. It does have long-term effects on people's lack of understanding and expectation, which then is used to attempt to justify U.S. foreign policy and resource allocation, particularly towards military. It's not, and again, I don't want to say that digital media don't matter, because digital media do matter to some groups, but it's communication that really matters, and it's who has access and how to the production of content, and the potential for groups that don't agree with the dominant discourse, the potential of people to assert alternative opinions, that matters. And creating ways for people to have political difference, that media can become important. So it's not a Facebook revolution, I would say, But political resistance needs to be understood as a long-term process, and it's about power, not just about technology. But the problem for U.S. media discourse is that our narratives are privileging this bright potential of digital media, and because of that, we're missing the human story. We're missing the understanding of this as a human collective engagement. And so, at least for the American community that I'm tend to be writing for, I want people to understand that Egypt is much bigger and more complicated than a 2-week Facebook revolution. Part of the problem is that there are many ways to tell stories, and what I'm particularly interested in is creating ways that different groups with different perspectives can tell their stories and have them heard. So I'm going to end there and open for discussion. One thing that would be interesting for me to hear about is how other media that you're more familiar with covered the same kind of political issues, whether other media were also talking about Facebook and digital media. Mm-hmm.
Watched lately have been very heroic videos about the vigilance of the protesters, and they play very dramatic music, and it's a very nationalistic dialogue, which is good, I guess, for some people, but I wonder, it just leads me to wonder who's making the videos. So that's an interesting
Yeah, that's helpful. And so if somebody's actually putting music to it, it even, I think, amplifies the idea that it's a text that's created for a particular purpose, and it really is created.
With a very American song, which is that interaction is problematic, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
How the events in Egypt would affect Lebanon and the other parts of the Arab world. So this might be the difference. Yeah.
Well, do they also focus on the role of digital media and the internet in the Lebanese press?
At origin of many events that led to another Arab countries.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they were definitely focusing on that.
Did they talk about television at all and the importance of people's access to TV to learn more about what was happening from country to country? Yeah.
The television was definitely playing a role because they were highlighting the events that were happening and the atrocities of the government, etc. And it was affecting the other countries of the Arab world.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
You want the voice in the camera? Yeah, so there was quite a bit of hype as well in Arab media about Facebook and Twitter, but I'd like to call it hype with a context, in the sense that there was also a lot of discussion of television. There was also a lot of discussion of several articles talk about the press and kind of revolts against the Ottomans. So there was kind of a somewhat different discourse, but the tenor in the sense of Facebook was very important. There was this kind of love of technology. But what I thought was very interesting, so the connection you made with foreign aid, and I think if you were to look the last months, the story of the U.S. NGO workers in Egypt,
Yes.
and how they were arrested and released, and the even on NPR, which I which I listened to at the office here, there seems to be that the argument is even if what they're doing is against Egyptian law, that's okay because it's in the name of aid and it's in the name of progress and it's in the name of leading Egypt to where it should be. So I think that would be kind of a very interesting kind of capstone to your argument, which is the merger of media constructions of foreign aid as a corollary to the arguments about digital media.
Well, what's also interesting about the story that you're mentioning is media constructions of democracy. So it's aid, but it's also a construction of democracy. And democracy in the U.S. Media perspective is what the U.S. says it should be. So it's what the U.S.-funded NGOs say it should be. So that is what democracy is, so therefore we should be doing that. The other kind of interesting angle to those stories was the attention on U.S. Transportation Secretary's son, who is one of the people who had been in prison. And so that kind of makes it this elite story. And part of the stories also tend to focus on the stories of the individuals rather than the patterns. But yes, I think that's an interesting story there as well in terms of a follow-up.
Thank you for your talk. I'm particularly interested in how you use the action-adventure films as a way to, I think, argue that media events are in many ways prefigured for us. That is, as things are happening, we're recycling narratives that are usually produced in the United States and often produced about the outside world, but action-adventure films are also about the United States itself. So it leads me to think about whether media representations of the Egyptian revolution are, if you're arguing that they actually say much more about U.S. domestic concerns, about terrorism, about, I don't know, beset middle-class white manhood, about all of these other things that the action-adventure films speak for within the United States. I don't know if I asked that very well, but...
Well, in the book that I wrote about action-adventure film, I do a little bit of, I give it some attention to the masculinity narrative and the way it's also related to the dominance of white middle-class culture in the telling of those stories. And I like the way you put that, the recycling of narratives. That is what happens. And it also happens, perhaps some of my friends here are journalists can speak to this, when you have to do news quickly. You have to write stories quickly. There's a structure that gets used over and over again, in part because people are asked to produce stories very quickly. Some journalists have the luxury of having more time to write more thematic pieces, to have a few weeks to think and write context. But often there's a structure. Here's the event. You have 2 hours to write it. You have this, write it quickly. And so it's easy to fall back into those kinds of quick structures. That kind of immediacy is not true in film, though, because in film it takes a long time to write a script, to get it funded, to find a producer, to find a director, to get actors. Sometimes actors quit over scripts that they don't like. Casey Kasem quit the Transformers for some good reasons. So it takes a long time to make a film, particularly a large global Hollywood film, and yet they still seem to fall into the same kinds of recycled narratives over and over again. And people in the industry will say that it's because that's what makes money. They don't want to risk capital by venturing out and doing something different. So that's one reason that the industry will give. Other people in the industry will say, well, popular culture is not political. That's another argument that I've heard. And so we shouldn't even worry about the politics of popular culture. It's just entertainment. But clearly it's such an important part of our political socialization, I think it does matter. And in terms of thinking about heroes in the U.S. narrative, I've heard people say that the U.S. likes to think of itself as Superman, but the rest of the world thinks of the U.S. more like Batman. Batman's a little bit more dark. Yes.
I was interested in what you said about how communication matters because it has the potential to contest hegemonic discourse. And I was wondering if you could speak to like what moments like this that you've seen this happen, and where are sites of resistance that can manifest to hegemonic discourse.
Let me just say about what I mean by hegemonic discourse. And she's next, right there behind. She's next. Okay. So by hegemonic discourse, I mean that there are some ways of telling stories that dominate. So who gets to tell history? Who gets to describe history? And who gets to describe which events matter in history books? So by hegemonic, I mean two things. One, that one group gets to tell the stories more than others. And two, that it's a process, and there's potential for resistance. So an example of the control of discourse, I was living in Hong Kong before the transition from British to Chinese rule, right at the time when the people who were in charge of the history textbooks for the Hong Kong curriculum removed Tiananmen Square from the history. And this is also a time when Rupert Murdoch was working with the Chinese government to say that he could have trans-satellite, transnational TV if they didn't show any documentaries criticizing Mao. That's an example of an assertion of dominant control. There are times when groups can change the narrative, and there's some really interesting political sociology work on this subject. And I'm more familiar with the United States than I am other places. Anti-war movements have been sometimes able to change the discourse about war. Often the United States goes into war with a kind of a broad scale justification, a broad mentality of we are doing this for this kind of idealistic notion. And when the narrative changes to people, individuals who are killed, and the families of people who are killed, then that change in the stories that we hear can shift public opinion. And when there are changes in the elite within the country, potentially change justification for war as well. We have a lot of controversy in the United States right now, and a lot of competing narratives about whether or not people of the same sex can marry and get benefits. There's stories. That's kind of a moment for political contest right now. When groups organize to try to change their representation in television and film, there are some groups that are more successful than others in getting that to happen in various ways. I want to get to your question.
You were talking how TV may have played a bigger role in media coverage since it had more accessibility than Facebook and Twitter. But the thing is, I think it's very hard to trust TV coverage. Personally, I would much more trust a YouTube video recorded by a civilian than the media coverage of what was happening in Egypt. I don't know if you...
I'd be happy to talk about that.
I think because I think the social media, it's not maybe a Facebook revolution, but it had helped to document the things more trustfully than other.
I think that's a really interesting issue, and I'm so glad you raised that. And that the broader issue is trust in a particular medium, and trust in a specific text. So let me take those separately. People, I think, have good reason to not trust certain sources of information. And we learn that when certain stations, whether they're funded by the Egyptian government, the American government, the British government, whether it's BBC, we have a different sense of trust. It's also interesting that people have different senses of trust over television versus print versus social media. And there, I think, is a sense that people will trust an individually created site of information if you know who that individual is, particularly, or if you know where that individual comes from. What I think, the critique that I think still needs to happen, though, is that people can create information, whether it's YouTube videos or a website, under the guise of all sorts of things. It's one of the the reasons why so many people celebrate the potential liberatory element of the digital media, because you can disguise your name, your organization, your gender. You can pretend to be all kinds of things. And there are examples of governments and groups pretending to be something else and posting things. If you read reviews of various products, for example, some companies pay people to write individual reviews that are positive of their products, right? So this happens. So the sense of trust, I think, is interesting in a cultural sense of what we tend to trust as a source of information, but then also the kinds of ways that we engage in critique. One of the things that I think is interesting in the U.S. culture right now is that more people get their news from The Daily Show than any other news source. And it's interesting because that is a source that is, in some senses, very critical of existing political regimes. In other senses, it's not really offering new information that's different from what is existing. It's more responsive, and it's still, in senses, economically structured to profit. So in some senses, it's not really that radical, but in other senses, it engages in critique. But because it also engages in critique, people tend to trust it as a source more than other sources. This issue of trust, I think, is so interesting. And there have been a lot of studies done, too, in whether we trust people as sources of information more than news. And, of course, that also depends on who you're talking to and your familiarity with that person. Please.
I'm a journalist as well as being a student here, and I tend to avoid hanging out with other journalists as much as I can in the Middle East, because I find that they tend to, American journalists in particular, tend to have this same mentality that you might find in the US government, which is that they're coming here to do people a favor, to liberate them. I had a long debate with an NPR reporter just over this weekend who was describing the governments here as mafias and the societies as uncivilized. And I find this over and over and over again, and it's extremely frustrating to work with editors in Washington or London who are bent on directing the news in a way that relates to their own governments. So I think that a lot of times the news is directed in a way that, just as you had said, that Hollywood will say, well, this is what sells. A lot of journalists will say, well, this is what somebody in Oklahoma cares about. They don't care about something unless it's related to American foreign policy, for example. So I'm wondering if you have an idea about how the media could change in a way that it wouldn't be guided from this model. Because I know that when I go back to the States and I talk to my friends, they're very much interested in hearing human stories, learning about different cultures, not being by this. And the second question is related to what you talked about, the role of the victim. And I'm working on a story now that relates to, I don't know if you heard what happened in Morocco. There was this uproar over a young woman who was raped, and then is allowed, the rapist could then marry her to get out of the story. And there's a similar law in Lebanon. So I'm wondering how to cover a story about women, for example, when feminists themselves are fighting against traditional structures of patriarchy, for example, or religion, that tend to reinforce this stereotype of a society being more backwards or more traditional, even though the same discourse is going on in the United States about female reproductive rights, for example.
Thank you. Okay. Try to take notes on everything you said. Tell me if I'm missing something. Let me start with the first point about how to structure journalists within the news process. This is a big question, and I'm just going to touch upon it very briefly. But I think part of the issue about news and constructions has to do with news as a creation of a media text that responds to not only organizational pressures, but also is situated within this broader dominant ideology. So there's some things you can do and some things you can't. One of the issues that news organizations have to make is whether to assign people to a place for a short period of time or a longer period of time. And there are odd assumptions made about people being able to go into a country where they don't know the language, have no familiarity for a short period of time, as being, there's an assumption that then they'll be more objective because they don't know anything. Against more of an approach where you assign someone for a longer period of time, where they do know the language and can get to know the culture a bit more. The concern, the argument against that some news journalists in the United States would make is against the idea that they will no longer be objective. It's also this invisibility of privilege, the idea that you don't have any perspective at all if you're upper middle class and white. You don't have any perspective. You're the objective person. The economics of the industry more and more moving toward freelance journalists and not paying people has to do with trying to avoid paying benefits and all these other things, but it works to the advantage of the organizations in that they can pick and choose stories as they like. One of my favorite stories from a friend of mine who's a photojournalist in Cairo is that he gets assignments and he gets told things like, go to an internet cafe and make sure you have a camel in the background. Because that's what Time magazine wants. They want a photo like that. So you asked how to change the media. There is a way of trying, and there's a whole approach called media advocacy. And what media advocacy is trying to do is to move stories from episodic to thematic coverage. Episodic coverage is what we get when it's very short and you get a description of the episode itself. And that's useful in getting people's attention. People want human stories. It's compelling. The trick is to structurally find a way that a journalist or an author or filmmaker has the ability to move from not just the story of the individual, but to the broader issue. So in other words, if we're trying to change media coverage of healthcare in the United States, you can start with a story of one person who doesn't have enough money for their treatment, and that's a compelling story and it's a sad story. But then the trick is to move it from not just being about that individual, but to the broader theme, the broader pattern. What percentage of people do not have health insurance? What percentage of people are raped in a particular culture? So the story of the individual is a hook to get people interested in that issue, but then there's got to be a movement toward this is why it matters so much. That's that broader theme. So you also asked how to change media. 3 broad ways to think about engaging in change: working within the system, working against the system, working in parallel to the system. One of the things you can do is to try to change the nature of people who do the work and the rewards and incentives within an industry for doing something well. You can also think about working against a media system by organizing things like boycotts and protests against a particular show or issue. And then what's really becoming more and more possible with digital media is working in parallel to the mainstream media, creating sources of information that are not just against the dominant ideas, but working in parallel to them. This is the importance of alternative film, for example. The importance of having festivals that recognize and reward independent thinking in media products. The last thing you asked about was women. And in my work on development, I spent a lot of time thinking about this issue of how women become visible in development, how it's problematic, and what to do about it. So when women become visible as victims, I would say it's problematic in part because it's a very limited characterization. Just as I was talking about moving from episodes of individual stories to themes, it's not just that women have problems, but there are power problems in society. So it's not an issue of women, I would say, but of gender. So it's tragic that a woman, an individual woman, has been raped. It fits a broader story of gender problems and power dimensions. So there's a way of not ignoring the story of women, but understanding it within this broader system of power, where most rapes don't get reported because it's not something that society wants to acknowledge. So that's part of the issue. And why is it okay that this happens? So it's that broader issue of gender that I think becomes important. In the same way in development work, I wouldn't say that we shouldn't give money to programs for women. I think that it's important. But if you look at development as a field overall, the way women become visible in development is because they have children and feed families. So you have a lot of money for population programs and nutrition programs because of what they do for others. You don't have as much money for teaching women skills so they can be economically independent. And that has to do with gender dynamics. So that's my response to your question there. It's not that we shouldn't pay attention to the problems and the tragic instances of women, but to understand how it's not just about women, but also about men.
I guess what I was asking in the case of women is how to tell the narrative in such a way that it's not reinforcing this Orientalist discourse of women in a backward society, where at the same time they are fighting against traditional culture in a lot of ways.
Right, and that's a tricky one because it is important, as you say, not to reinforce the Orientalist stereotypes. There are sometimes you can avoid certain adjectives and certain ways of saying, well, this is because it is a traditional culture. One of the things that I feel most worried about when I read stories about women in the region is the word traditional that gets put on as an adjective to cultural attributes when it's not about modern versus traditional at all. So that's just one small way, just to think about the way the program, the problem is described, and describing it as one of violence, but not making generalizations more broadly. Yes, Habib.
I find it really interesting to look at things in terms of the victim and the villain, and we see that a lot on Arab TV. And I'm wondering, also where that comes from, and also what you said about Facebook is very interesting too, because so what we see a lot on Al Jazeera is they've created a series of packages that are small kind of commercials that run in between the news about the revolutions. There's one about Syria, there's one about Yemen, etc. And obviously the villain is the dictator and the victim is the people, and
right.
And these have music, and in the end with "I'm going to come get you, Gaddafi," some guy screaming in the street. They played over and over and over and over again. So I'm wondering about the motivations. I guess here we kind of simplify it and say, well, Al Jazeera is just either looking after its ratings or it's looking after its political policy, and I guess it's hard to get into motivations. And maybe think of that with your Facebook example too. I mean, do you think that obviously I never thought of it. Yeah, Facebook is probably doing great because of the free advertising it's getting. Do you think that that's people are conscious of that, like when they're working on this issue? I mean, is there an editor that's saying, this is great, we're making money on our stock right now, or are these just, and again, if you look at the Arab example too, I mean, is Al Jazeera consciously pursuing a political agenda, or is it, looking after getting, where the people want, where the readers or the viewers are where they're going to boost their ratings? So I don't have any answers, and I guess it's just
Well,
a comment.
I'm going to draw a distinction between the strategic communication that people intentionally create and the more subtle, latent kind of ideologies that structure what we write, what we say, what we do. So some groups can strategically create a message, and this is what media advocacy is about. This is what groups that are protesting are about, creating a slogan, communicating a theme. I just saw on TV the Say No to Terror campaign, so I'm interested in learning more about this as well. So that's an example of a group saying, I intend to create this specific message and I want this message to go out. I think that what's really important, though, is not just those intentional strategic messages that are particular but the subconscious ideas, the conventional wisdom that people have when they're writing. And so I would say that I don't see some grand intentional conspiracy by Google or Facebook. I don't. I don't think that they wanted someone to be held and abused for the sake of Google. I don't think that at all. So I don't think that there's an intentional, explicit conspiracy. I do think, though, that there's a sense of conventional wisdom, and you know you've gone against it when you say something or do something that people get upset about. That's when you know you've broken the rules. So kind of in an ethnographic sense, it's breaking the rules that help us understand where the boundaries are. So to answer your question, I think it's more subtle. It's more automatic. So when I was interviewing focus groups, and I asked, one of the questions I asked people was, say you were a consultant to Hollywood, and you could rewrite the action adventure. You could write any action adventure script that you want. What would you do? And when the Arab American group said, well, we would make the hero Arab. And then they all laughed, that would never sell. That's interesting, though. Why? There's kind of this subtle set of expectations about what a hero needs to look like. And for a long time, women weren't heroes in film or in popular culture. Over time in the U.S. media, we now have some attention to women as heroes, but for a long time, female heroes couldn't be heroes unless they wore high heels. And they had to look a particular way. It's only more recently that we have women now as heroes if they're very athletic. They have to be very strong. And now, you see the film The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, you have to have lots of, and also in The Terminator, for a female to be a hero, you have to have a lot of shots of her exercising and showing that she has physical strength, which is kind of interesting. But so the notion of hero can change over time. Thanks very much. I really appreciate this opportunity.